mission.
But is this your man on the moon moment?
You're listening to EU Watchdog Radio.
Hi, welcome to a brand new episode of EU Watchdog Radio. I'm Joana, Comms Officer at Corporate Europe Observatory, and this episode is quite something. I talked to my colleague Nina Holland and to Rachel Radvany, who is an environmental health campaigner at the Center for International Environmental Law, or CIEL. And Nina, by the way, is a researcher and campaigner at CIEL, and she focuses mainly on agribusiness and GMOs. And together with CIEL, we at CIEL have launched a briefing into how the industry blocks regulation of toxic chemicals. It's called the Pollution Playbook, and it's really a great read. You can check it out in our website, and I'm going to talk to Rachel and Nina about it. But that's not all. For this episode, I've also spoken to Olivier De Schutter, legal scholar and university professor, specializing in economic and social rights, and who served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food from 2008 till 2014, and in 2020 was appointed as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. So, stick around. My first question to the co-authors was why it was important to do this briefing. Nina Holland is the person you will hear first, and then Rachel Radvany.
We are facing multiple environmental crises, right? And there is the toxic pollution crisis that is not all too often discussed, but that exists next to the breakdown of ecosystems and the climate crisis. So these are interrelated environmental crises that we have to address, that are really urgent because of the harm that toxic pollution is doing to human health, but also to the environment and ecosystems. But in fact, one of the things that is blocking us from tackling it is that the chemical industry and their lobby groups are using their influence to weaken regulations and simply to keep pushing their products on the market.
We as CIEL engage in a lot of global policy spaces, including on chemicals and waste, and in particular in those meetings, the chemicals industry usually shows up and portrays themselves as a partner in creating the solutions to the problems that they are causing by their pollution and toxic products. And their main claim is, we are the ones that make the products, we have the data on the products, so therefore we can offer our help in creating solutions. And that is a really powerful argument with policymakers, but in reality, that's not actually what happens. And so we felt it was really important to kind of show examples of how that claim doesn't hold up when you actually look into the details.
The main findings of this briefing is that industry has a host of lobbying tactics that affect science and that undermine independent science. There is extensive academic literature on this.
This is Nina again. She's highlighting the main results of the research.
NGOs have been calling the alert on this aspect many times. And what we have done is compile 4 key examples and list the tactics that industry is using in order to inform decision makers why industry is not reliable as a deliverer of science. Some of these tactics include, for instance, undermining independent science, independent papers, by damning the reputation of the scientists or qualifying it as not relevant. They often point to other causes of harm, so they will fund their own scientific papers that will focus on other causes of a particular disease. This was, of course, famous in the tobacco industry case, where they would always, for decades, look for other causes for lung cancer instead of smoking. Well, this tactic has been repeated many times by the chemical and other industries.
Before we go into the 4 specific case studies of the briefing about bisphenol A or BPA, PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, benzene and pesticides, Olivier De Schutter talked to me about why, at the level of European decision-making processes, lobbying by big business has been so effective.
When the new Commission entered into function after the June 2024 elections, then started the dismantling of the Green Deal, and in particular a number of regulations that were meant to make food systems more sustainable are now being revised, amended, largely as a result of the efforts of the agri-food sector, but especially as a result of the efforts of the input suppliers, the chemical companies and the energy companies that provide the inputs for food production in the form of fertilizers, in the form of seeds and pesticides, and that is where the lobbies have been most effective. And I would like to highlight here that in the current context, this lobbying by these agri-chemical lobbies is particularly effective for 3 reasons. First, because of the alliance between the center-right politicians of the European People's Party on the one hand and the far-right radical parties on the other hand. And it is this alliance, this very toxic alliance, leading the European People's Party to move towards more radical right positions that has been so effective in dismantling the Green Deal. The second reason why this lobbying is so effective is because of a Swedish parliamentarian, Jörgen Warborn, who is the rapporteur on the omnibus proposals of the European Commission and whom we know has very close connections with US corporate interests, particularly through the International Democracy Union, the IDU, established in the early 1980s at the initiative of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and that brings together a sort of international of the far right. And Jörgen Warborn is a very strong member of that transatlantic alliance, bringing together groups from the far right, both from the United States and from Europe. And then the third reason why this lobbying is so effective is that since the publication of the September 2024 report by Mario Draghi, the former president of the European Central Bank, insisting on the need for the EU to be more competitive in order to meet the challenge of the US and China, the EU has adopted a compass on competitiveness and puts many efforts into making its economy more competitive, even if that means deregulating, which was not the intention of the Draghi report, but which is how it was interpreted. And so unfortunately, the lobbies today have become extraordinarily powerful, using MEPs that unscrupulously are selling out the EU regulatory system to foreign interests. And it's a lobby that is really insisting that the EU should increase food production at all costs, even if this results in new dependencies, particularly on fossil energies.
And now back to the briefing and to the 4 case studies.
On bisphenol A, which is one of the most widely known bisphenols, it's a group of chemicals often used in plastic products as an additive. There is a lot of independent science on the harms of bisphenol A. It's an endocrine disrupting chemical, meaning it affects the hormone system, and it can have a lot of effects on human health, and that is very well documented by independent science. And what we found for bisphenol A was that multiple times, so 3 times in total, the plastics industry sued the European Chemicals Agency, which is the agency that regulates chemicals and similar products in the European Union. They had bisphenol A listed on the substances of very high concern for its endocrine disrupting properties. and the plastics industry basically sued to block that from going through on the classification of bisphenol A. They sued 3 different times for 3 different reasons for classifying BPA on that substances of very high concern list, and they lost all 3 times.
Well, regarding PFAS, there is strong and growing evidence from independent scientists that this category of chemicals should be regulated and restricted. They are really problematic and they are highly persistent in the environment. But what we have shown is that the producers of PFAS products like 3M or Chemours, they have hidden the evidence of harm for decades to evade and fight regulations. So they actually already knew by the 70s that these chemicals would be highly toxic when inhaled, for instance. That was 40 years before the wider public and decision makers knew about the harms. And yet they kept inventing new strategies, like the tobacco industry, like the pharmaceutical industry, to delay regulatory action. And when finally some of their products got banned or restricted, they would come up and they would have developed already substitutions for other substances that are slightly different and replace them on the market from the old PFAS products. That is a process known as regrettable substitution. So one product gets banned, but it simply gets replaced by another substance that is equally harmful or harmful in a different way. But then it will again take years and years for that to be sufficiently proven, etc. So they keep making the profits. In the case of PFAS, what they also did is, for instance, fund their own science to justify exempting entire classes of PFAS from regulation.
And for benzene, I found that there were investigative journalists who did research on a front group, basically, that the fossil fuel industry created. So it was created by oil companies like Shell and BP, called CONCAWE, which stands for Conservation of Clean Air and Water in Europe, which sounds very nice, but it is actually created by the oil industry. And so investigative journalists did a lot of research into their activities, and they found that even though in the internal industry documents they recognized that benzene was incredibly unsafe, that the only safe concentration of benzene is really 0, they still tried to lobby the European Chemicals Agency to, when they were updating the regulations to limit exposure of benzene to workers, they tried to lobby against a lower limit to basically maintain that license to keep polluting. Yeah, and in the case of benzene, they were actually successful in, they weren't completely successful, but the regulation that the European agency proposed was much lower than what they ultimately ended up agreeing on. They didn't agree exactly on the industry recommendation, but it was very, very close to it. So they were successful in raising the limit of exposure, which really harms, in particular, workers, and it's because it was an occupational exposure limit.
So regarding pesticides, we found that the industry used several of these tactics to undermine science. One of the most shocking examples is ghostwriting. So that was revealed through the Monsanto papers, for instance, that Monsanto would ghostwrite or partially ghostwrite certain papers that would show that glyphosate was not causing cancer in humans. Now, finally, after more than 10 years, one of these papers has finally been retracted because ghostwriting is actually scientific fraud. But decisions around the world have been made in part on the basis of this paper, including in the EU. So this is a clear signal. Why would you trust these companies if they are prepared to go as far as ghostwriting? Now, in the case of the neonicotinoids, companies like Bayer and Syngenta have been going very far, even threatening with legal action if the EU, based on scientific evidence, would restrict or ban some of these very harmful insecticides that are very harmful to bees and other pollinators. So they threatened with legal action, but they also employed so-called product defense companies like Exponent, which they called an independent bee science panel. But in fact, it is a group composed by this company Exponent that was employed by Bayer in order to show that actually it's not these insecticides that are causing the harm, but another cause, the varroa mite in this case. So that is another example where industry has been, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence that these insecticides are very harmful, keeps trying to keep these products on the market in the EU and in European countries at the national level.
So what were like the most what was the most shocking discovery that you've made? Why was this briefing so important and urgent right now?
Something that is surprising to me was the fact that it was around occupational exposure for benzene. I think when we're talking about the transition to clean energy, transition away from fossil fuels, a lot of the industry arguments against transitioning are about jobs. The narrative that they are writing is about how oil and fossil fuels and petrochemicals bring jobs to communities and bring local jobs and things like that. And so that is really useful for them in terms of building up the economic argument of why we need to maintain reliance on fossil fuels, even if you look at the data and there aren't actually not that many local jobs being created at a lot of these facilities. But then when you look at the actual details of a regulation that is supposed to protect workers, right, and protect these people that the industry is claiming to care about by saying that we need to bring the industry in to create jobs, they are actively undermining protections that would lead to better health outcomes and reduce the risk for people working in these industries. So I think that kind of cognitive dissonance was very interesting for me.
Well, I think it's specifically urgent now in this political context, also in the EU, because previously the EU chemical and pesticide regulations were seen as the most strict in the world. Yet we do have this huge PFAS pollution that causes widespread harm. People are no longer able to let their kids play outside in many areas or eat the vegetables from their garden. And nobody is willing or able to pay for cleaning up, and the companies are not paying for it either. So you should think that it's very clear that the chemical industry should be kept away from decision making when it's about public health. But right now, the von der Leyen Commission is doing the exact opposite. So the shift to the right in the EU Parliament, but also in the Council, so the EU member states, that means that they're actually attacking the regulations that we have through so-called omnibus proposals. So they make new legislative proposals that would actually weaken the current regulations on chemicals, but also on pesticides. The Commission is also opening up new inroads for lobbying for the big polluting companies, such as implementation dialogue. So they're actively inviting big polluters to tell them which laws they find annoying. But the costs to society and to the environment, the cleanup that should happen, the harm to health, that is not being borne by these big polluting companies. That is being borne by society. So these lobby groups from the chemical industry, they are really seeing their chance, and they are calling on the Commission to even further increase industry involvement at all stages of the development of these EU guidance documents, for instance. So they want to avoid that the EU again comes up with this bees guidance, for instance, that ended up restricting the insecticides. So they want to avoid that, and they want to get a say in a much earlier phase of decision making. They even want to weaken the EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, and get more of their industry experts in these scientific panel. These experts, of course, have a direct conflict of interest because they're paid by the companies. The current political situation is really very worrying, and that is why I think this briefing is even more timely.
We are almost at the end of this episode, but before we go, Olivier, Rachel, and Nina answered one big question, which is what should be done with this information that the industry uses deceptive tactics to keep producing and selling their toxic products. How could this conflict of interest be resolved?
One major problem in decision making in the EU is that it is heavily dependent on a limited number of lobbies that have a disproportionate weight in decision making. And it is, of course, normal for politicians, and indeed for the European Commission, to adopt policies based on the best information available. But the problem is that it always consults the same groups that have captured decision making. For example, Corporate Europe Observatory has highlighted the very important role that COPA-COGECA has in DG Agri, the general directorate that is responsible for the shaping of the common agricultural policy. And of course, COPA-COGECA is important, but it is only one of the unions that represent farmers, and many other unions are far more progressive and far more attentive to sustainability concerns. So ideally, decision-making should be based only on the best scientific evidence available. It should not be based on the demands of the lobbies, and especially not on the weight of the lobbies that are the best organized to defend their interests and that have the most resources to spend on influencing politicians. Let me just give one example. The European Chemical Industry Council, CEFIC, has an annual budget of 45 million euros to lobby the European institutions. They employ 164 corporate lobbyists in their interests, and they represent BASF, Bayer, as well as some major gas and oil companies, ExxonMobil, Shell, Total Energy, for example. Now, BASF, Bayer are good examples of companies that not only provide chemical inputs to the farming sector, but also provide seeds, and that merger between the seed companies on the one hand and the chemical companies on the other hand is a major problem, because today farmers depend on those seeds provided by these multinationals that are combined with the herbicides and pesticides that this very same companies often provide. And farmers therefore are heavily dependent on those companies, who therefore can say that if the demands of the lobbies are not listened to, then the price of food will increase. And that is the conundrum in which we are caught, or the predicament in which we are caught, and we must absolutely reverse this trend. So regulation, establishing strong firewalls between those lobbies and decision-making would be much desirable, although I don't think it would be a substitute for changing our way of farming in Europe.
On the one hand, I think just continuing to document all the ways that the industry is manipulating science, manipulating data, undermining independent science, all of those kinds of things is really important to continue to reduce their social license, to continue producing polluting products, and also to have this privileged access to decision makers. I think that's the most dangerous part, because that leads to delays in regulation and delays in policies that would protect people and the environment.
And to then follow the approach by, for instance, the World Health Organization, the Tobacco Framework Convention, which basically bans tobacco lobbyists from hanging around with decision makers when it comes to public health policies. So the same should go for instance, oil companies that should have no business in climate policies, and chemical corporations should have no business in health or environmental policies.
Banning them from having lobby meetings, hosting events that are aimed to lobby policymakers, things like that, and then also increasing transparency where any interactions do take place. I think that's the ultimate goal. But these kinds of reports, I think, continue to document the long and clear history of manipulation and manufacturing doubt and undermining of independent science, that these industries are, they're using the same playbook.
And secondly, of course, these corporations should be held accountable for the damage that they are causing, and they should be made to pay, because in the end, in the EU, we adhere to the polluter pays principle. It's just not being applied.
Well, if we look at the situation globally, it's not only in the European Union that the far right is pushing the center right to become each time more leaning in their direction.
This is me, really, very clumsily, asking Olivier basically what can be done. After him, Rachel and Nina will also describe ways in which people can get involved with this topic and hopefully organize to push for solutions.
What exit do you see? Like what possible paths do we have?
The single most effective strategy to avoid the European farming system being captured by the lobbies from the chemical industry and from the fossil energy companies is to move to agroecology. Agroecology means a form of farming that is much less dependent on external inputs, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and that is not only healthier for the environment and for the health of European consumers. It is also a way of farming that is much less expensive for the farmer, although it is more labor intensive. The problem today is that the farming system is heavily dependent on inputs in the hands of these agrochemical companies and the seed companies that are increasingly concentrated, that are very well organized, for example, through the European Chemical Industry Council, the CEFIC, and that can really blackmail politicians in the EU by saying that if they are too heavily regulated, then the costs of farming will increase because the cost of inputs will increase. And I think that is the major problem that we face. So the solution really of agroecology is not simply for better soil health, for better protection of the health of consumers, and for greater sustainability of food systems. It's also the best way to avoid those lobbies having a disproportionate weight in decision-making in the EU.
On the decision-making front, I think it's always important for people to talk about this with their representatives in whatever local, state, country, or regional governance systems that they live in. And so I think continuing to make it clear to policymakers that this is something that's important to you. Here in the U.S., we often call our senators and representatives and talk about issues that we want them to take up. And so I think to what extent that makes sense for people in the country that they live in, I think that's a really good way of getting involved, both on the chemical regulation side, but also on the corporate capture side. I think we're seeing more and more corporate capture around the world right now, and that's something that's really scary, both for the legitimacy of policymaking spaces, but also like real direct impacts on human health. So I think that's on one side of things. And then on the more chemical side, I think for me personally, I think that for all of these kinds of issues, we need systemic change because individual actions are not going to add up to get to that change unless we actually have regulations and incentives that lead us there. But I think on the chemical side, that is something that you can do to protect yourself personally. Like all of these products that the chemicals industry is producing have really, really drastic impacts on human health. And so I think to the extent possible where people are able to make choices for non-toxic products, like products that don't have BPA in it, products that don't have PFAS in it, products that are free from pesticides, things like that. I think to protect your own personal health, plastic-free products I think is a really important one too, because plastics have a lot of these chemicals in them, even if we are told that they are inert, which they're not. So I think in terms of getting involved on the issue of toxic chemicals, that is a way that people can get involved. I think those small lifestyle changes can have really big impacts on limiting your own exposure to these chemicals. And we still obviously need the systemic change because it's hard to make those lifestyle changes because the incentives are for single-use plastics and products that have forever chemicals in them. There may not always be other options. So I think where it's possible, if people are able to make those changes, I think that's a really good step. But we can't lose sight of the broader question of systemic change.
There is a lot that people can do. Of course, you can join a local group that is fighting PFAS pollution. You can support groups that help farmers to move away from pesticides. You can choose to eat organic. There are campaigns being set up, petitions calling for big polluters to be kicked out of climate or biodiversity negotiations. There will soon also be petitions to fight the omnibus proposals by the Commission, for instance, on the one on food and feed, that is on the one on pesticide regulation. So I think it's a good idea to follow us on our social media channels and you will be informed.
We have come to the end of this podcast. Thank you so much, Nina, Rachel, and Olivier. If you like this podcast and you value the work of CEO, please help us stay independent. Sign in to our newsletter at corporateeurope.org and follow us on social media. The next episode will be hosted by our friends at Counterbalance. Till next time, bye-bye.